I love that we can celebrate that. I love, the newness of life and what children and everything represent. But now talking about celebration, whenever I think of celebration, immediately what comes to mind is food. How many of you also thought food? Yeah, okay. Okay, food. Celebration and food always seem to go hand in hand. And so I want you to do something right now. I want you to think about the best meal you've ever had. Think about the best meal you've ever had and just imagine yourself there eating it, the experience, the people around you. Don't do it too long. I need you to come back and focus on the rest I'm going to say. But just think now about the best meal experience you've ever had. Meals in our home were always a big deal. Meals in our home growing up were always exciting and fascinating. Some of you might wonder, really? Could it be? But just to give an example, meals were so popular in the Hurlow home that even before I was born, when my brothers were still toddlers, my mom would tell us about a farmer who would drive for kilometers and come, it was like clockwork every morning, and just sit and watch my mom feeding these 3 triplets. He found it so amusing. And the news got out that, Lenora had these triplets and the feeding time is fascinating. And people would actually come and watch. And she had it down to fine art where she had all 3 little kids up on, high stools. And she would start with one, the other 2 would be crying already. She'd start with one. As she'd get to the 3rd one, the first one was already crying and screaming. And then she'd go. And she'd move so quickly that as children, they never had the opportunity to be fussy eaters or because if you didn't want your scoop, there was always someone that was going to take it and always someone that would be willing. And so even when I came along as a little baby, I learned from a very young age, you eat the food that is in front of you and you appreciate it because you fight for it. And often we had to. And so I remember meals in the Hurlow home were always a fascinating and an interesting thing. One girl who came and stayed with us in her last year of high school, we were still quite young, she was a little bit older, but she actually wrote her final essay for creative writing about breakfast in the Hurlow home. And she got an A. Okay, I don't know what that means, but because there wasn't a breakfast that went by where we didn't spill the milk, or we didn't break something or drop something, and we were always fighting about the food. Peanut butter was a real interesting one. We so loved peanut butter that we would consume a jar at every sitting. Okay. Eventually, my mom resorted to buying us each our own individual jar, writing our names on it, and that jar had to last you the month. Okay. If it ran out, and that was the best way to get at your brothers. If you were angry with them, you did a few spoons into their peanut butter jar, and that was bad. People got wind of this, and sometimes parents actually sent their kids to our home to cure them of fussy eating. Okay, or I remember one family that actually invited us to their home, and that was often a very rare occasion because the idea of 5 hungry, because my dad was part of this, the idea of 5 hungry males coming to your home daunted most people, and we never really got many invites. But I remember one time where there was this girl, she wouldn't eat. Her parents struggled for ages, and she just wouldn't eat. And at this meal, they had the parents sitting at one table and the kids at another table. And the mom confessed she had been trying to get her daughter to eat hours before we came, like 3 hours, just to try to get something in there because her daughter just would never eat. Hurlows arrived, we sat at the table and we started eating, and this girl just watched as everything on the table just started disappearing in seconds. And hands were just going, woo, woo, and the food was disappearing. And from that day, she's never been a fussy eater. And so very few people in Vicksburg, guess because of the Hurlows and meal reputation, were fussy eaters, which is a great thing. I think that's our contribution to the world. But I remember later on as we got older, we would always eat our meals around the table. And that was something it was great because that's where the best family discussions happen. That's where the moments of connecting, the moments of community really happen. That's where all the awesome good things, the memories that come in, and I can think of some of the philosophizing and different, whatever happened, it all happened around the meal table, around meals. How many of you can identify with this? Yeah. It's great things, meals, aren't they? They're great celebrations. And with good food often comes, good drink and just good times. And it's great. So you've been thinking about your best meal moment ever. Where is it? Can you see it? Can you see the people who were there, who you shared it with? What were you eating? And does that even matter? So often the meal moments we remember aren't necessarily about the food. For some of us they are, but it's about the people that were there. Now, why I want you to connect with this emotionally, especially this morning, is for two reasons. Two things happen when we share a meal. Two things happen when we share a meal with people or with family. And here's what happens. We connect with family and with people over a meal. And the other thing that happens is we invite and we welcome people to become our friends or part of our family. So we connect with our family and friends and we invite people to become a part of that circle of friendship and family. Now, the Bible has a lot to say about fellowship or having a meal together. It even talks about hospitality and welcoming strangers into your home. And when we look at the Bible, a lot of the meals or the feasts or celebrations that people had, God actually instructed the people to have those. So many of their feasts and their holidays that they shared were meals that God had told them, hey, do this. It's a great thing. And it brought the community together and built that fellowship and love that people had for each other. It's actually fascinating to look at the Bible through the lens of meals. Because what you find is that the Bible begins with eating. And it begins with a meal. And all through the rest of the story, there's meals and different things that happen with meals. And what's interesting about these meals is some of these meals happened without God, but some of these meals happened with God, where people actually invited God to be present. And it's interesting to see what happens around these meals, some without God, some with God, but then eventually, as the Bible began with meals, it ends talking about a meal, talking about that great banquet, that feast that we're going to have with God in His kingdom one day. So this whole idea of meals and the theme of meals is quite significant throughout the whole Bible. And at the center of it all, one of the key meals that the Bible mentions is, I guess, the reason why we have these tables in front of us here this morning. And this is the meal that is commonly known as or referred to as communion, or the Last Supper, or the Lord's Supper. Right at the center of the Bible and the story, we have this meal. And this is a meal that we have with God to remember Jesus Christ. And we eat this with friends, with God, and with others. And so our two focuses with this meal that we're going to be sharing, and I guess inviting all of you to share in this morning, is that we eat this meal with our church friends and our church family. And we also invite anyone to be a part of this meal and so to become a part of our friendship group and of our family. But today, before we get into this meal, I want to quickly take a brief look at some of the meals and some of the important meals in the Bible story before we actually lead up to this meal that we are going to share in and that we are going to have. And by the way, if you're worried about the small quantities here, we're going to have lunch afterwards, so that's great. The first meal is right in the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 3, it talks about a forbidden fruit. Many of you might be familiar with the story. Many of you might know it. If you're here for our Tree series early on in the year, we kind of discussed this and went over it. So I'm just going to go over it quickly, just give you a bit of the history. God created man. Man was in the Garden of Eden. Everything was perfect. Everything was good. I mean, if you love food and you love meals, this is your perfect scenario. Here, man is placed in an abundant, fruitful, organic garden, okay? You've got everything you'd ever need to make the best meals and have the best time together. And so God has placed Adam and Eve here. And many people get a wrong idea about what is happening here because they hear of this idea of the forbidden fruit or the forbidden tree, and they think, God is this God of rules. God is this God who, tells us we can't this and we can't that and we don't. When you actually look at it, God placed man in the garden, and there were thousands and thousands of you cans. You can eat of that tree. You can eat of that. You can take of this. You can grow this. You can have that. You can do whatever you want in this garden. You are free. Grace. This is the garden of grace. But there's just one. There's just one that I say, don't eat from. So what we find is the story continues. Adam and Eve find themselves, Eve at this tree, and the enemy of God, or the devil, he's referred to in this portion as the serpent or the snake. He deceived Eve. And Eve took of this forbidden fruit, the first meal we read about in the Bible, and she ate it. Adam, who was there with her, loved her too much, grabbed some as well and ate some as well. And I guess, as they say, the rest is history. What this led to, this first meal, and you see what is interesting here is this is the first meal and they had it without God. They had it without God. And what it led to was pain. What it led to was eventually the first death, the first experience of human sin. What it led to was suffering. What it led to was a whole lot of things happening in our world that just went totally wrong. And some of you think, how can this be such a little simple act that they did? How can it lead to such huge catastrophes? I mean, it's like picking the wrong thing from the fridge and suddenly all of humanity dies? Really? How can that be? But you see, what actually happened there at this first meal is the fact that they had it without God. Because you see, at a meal, you are inviting your friends. At a meal, you're making a statement that this is who I want to be connected to. This is who I want to engage with. And as such, the Bible considers and declares meals to be sacred. Meals to actually be an act of worship. Because we are inviting people to be a part of our lives and be a part of who we are. And here, Adam and Eve at this first meal, they invited Satan, the deceiver. They invited sin and death to be there with them. They had it without God. And that is what led, I guess, to this sin situation that we now find ourselves in. But right there as well, we read in Genesis 3, a promise was made where God said, I will send you a deliverer. I will send you a Messiah. You have made this choice and you have sat down at this table and chosen to side yourselves with Satan. But you know what? I will still make a way. I'll make a plan. And the story of the Bible continues. Many years later, actually a few thousand years later, a man from the same lineage by the name of Abraham is faithful to God, and he makes a covenant with God, and God leads him to a land, and he says, Abraham, I will make your nation plentiful. I'll make you like the sands of the sea. I will be your God if you will follow and do what I tell you. Eventually, one of Abraham's grandchildren, Jacob, he becomes the father of the nation of Israel. And the nation of Israel is born and live in this land that God had taken Abraham to. But then something happens. There is famine in the land, and that is interesting. Once again, the people couldn't eat. They couldn't share in the meals together. They couldn't have festivities. There's famine in the land. And the solution was provided through God, through Joseph, who he had prepared and sent down to Egypt. And so there was a way made by God for the nation to survive this famine, and they went and stayed in Egypt. Now, their time in Egypt wasn't all that I guess they had dreamed it would be. For a while it was okay, but then eventually the kings, the rulers over Egypt, didn't look so favorably on the nation of Israel. And instead, a Pharaoh came to power who actually was worried about the nation of Israel and thought that they might come and try and overthrow him, and so he forced them into slavery. He made their lives a living hell. He used them to try and expand and build his empire. He made them make bricks, and he forced them into slavery. Israel ended up being in Egypt for about 440 years. And while they were being subjected, while they were being oppressed, while they were being downtrodden, it says God heard their cries. God saw the affliction of his people, and he raised up a guy by the name of Moses. Moses came along, and he came to Pharaoh, and he told Pharaoh, he said, Pharaoh, God is giving you grace. Even though you have done all these things against God's people, even though you have set yourself up as God, people used to worship pharaohs as God. He says, you know what, Pharaoh, you are not God. There is the God who created the heavens and the earth. He is God. But even though you have set yourself up as God and oppressed his people, God is giving you grace. If you will let his people go, everything will be okay. God will let you carry on doing what you want to do, but you need to let his people go. And what did Pharaoh say? Okay, those of you who've watched Prince of Egypt? Okay, Pharaoh said, no, I'm not going to let God's people go. And eventually, God brought about some consequences for Pharaoh's decisions. God brought about consequences to help Pharaoh understand that the choices and the decisions he was making is not in his best interests. Okay? And these consequences were in the form of plagues. And we read about these plagues, we've heard about these plagues. Some were interesting, some were crazy, some were really weird, but it culminated finally in the 10th plague, which after everything that had gone wrong, Pharaoh had nearly lost all his livestock, all his cattle, all his crops, everything had gone wrong, and he still wouldn't let the people of Israel go. Moses came to him again and he said, Pharaoh, there is one last thing. And God says, please let his people go. He doesn't want to do this. He's a God of grace. And he said to Pharaoh, he said, if you don't let the people go, every firstborn in the land of Egypt, every firstborn in the land of Egypt is going to die. Now, once again, Pharaoh said to Moses, no, I will not let the people go. So God then instructed through Moses the nation of Israel, and he gave them a meal. He gave them a meal that would serve as protection, that would serve as a covering, a meal that would serve as a celebration of God delivering the people of Israel. And it's today known and called, and the Jews have celebrated it for many years, as the Passover meal. Because what happened is, God gave the instructions to Moses about how to take and prepare a lamb, a spotless lamb, one that is, and we learn now as we look back that God was using this to teach us and to teach the nation of Israel important truths about God and how he works to save you and I. And he told them, take a spotless lamb, take it into your house, take care of it, but then on the certain day, you need to kill it. You need to take its blood, take the blood of the lamb and sprinkle it over the doorposts. He also gave a whole lot of other instructions about how they need to prepare bread that doesn't have any leaven in it or doesn't have any yeast in it. And they need to eat that bread and eat this Passover lamb. But what was really important was that they had the blood of the lamb sprinkled over their doorpost. Because if they did this, then the night when the angel of God came to honor Pharaoh's choice, came to honor the consequences that Pharaoh had chosen for himself and for his people, when God came to honor that choice, he would pass over every house that had the blood of the lamb sprinkled on the door. And as we know in history, that night in Egypt was a terrible night. Every firstborn that didn't have the blood of the lamb sprinkled over the door died. But it was ultimately that event that led Pharaoh to let God's people go. And the story of Exodus commences, where the nation of Israel leave Egypt. Pharaoh eventually changes his mind and tries to chase after them, but that's another time, story for another time. But eventually they leave and they go into the promised land where God leads them and God directs them. And so here was this important meal, the Passover meal, where God was trying to communicate to them that I will save you. I will save you, not by anything you can do, not by anything you can gain, or not by a mighty king's command or a mighty king's decree, but I will save you by substitution. I will save you by the blood of the Lamb. A little innocent lamb and his blood. And as you share in this meal together, he then told them, he said, do this, remember this time, remember this moment, share in this Passover meal throughout the generations, and remember who I am and what I have done for you. Celebrate the salvation. Celebrate my provision. Celebrate the fact that I have seen your struggle, that I know your needs, that I understand your situation, and I will make a way. And I will lead you out from that place to a better place. For 1,500 years, Jews had been celebrating this meal together, the Passover. And then something interesting started happening. Jesus was born. Jesus was born, and many people wondered who Jesus was. He started teaching and preaching, and we read in John chapter 1, verse 29, Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, when Jesus came and was walking by where John the Baptist was baptizing, John the Baptist looked at him and he pointed to everyone who was there, and he pointed to him and he said, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." For 1,500 years, that Lamb of God was represented by the Passover lamb and celebrated as the Passover meal and the Passover feast. That lamb, that its blood allowed them to be saved on that day. And here John says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." Jesus and his disciples, in preparing to celebrate the Passover feast, we read about this in Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26, verse 17 to 30. And this is on page 596 in the Bible in the seat pocket in front of you. And I invite you to turn there with me. Matthew chapter 26, verse 17. And we'll read up until verse 19. Jesus, as was customary for any Jew, was going to celebrate the same meal with his disciples. And so as the month of Nisan had arrived, and it was the week that they started celebrating the whole idea of the Passover, Jesus said to his disciples, and we read from verse 17, "On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'Where do you want us to prepare the Passover meal for you?' As you go into the city," he told them, "you will see a certain man. Tell him that the teacher says, 'My time has come, and I will eat the Passover meal with my disciples at your house.'" So the disciples did as Jesus told them and prepared the Passover meal there. What I want us to note about this whole fact is that for the Passover meal, there was actually quite significant preparation. The people didn't just come together and they would actually plan and prepare, because as we'll see a little bit later, there was quite a lot of elements to this whole Passover meal. And of course, they had to get the lamb and get the lamb ready. And so Some of the disciples asked, where are we going to have it, Jesus? He said, hey, go find a guy. He'll lead you to a house. Get the preparations ready there. But one of the preparations that I want us to think about today, because we actually do this here at our church when we celebrate this meal. And this is a preparation that I guess was customary for a lot of the Jews, that whenever they'd come to share in a meal, they would wash. They would wash their hands. But also, if they had been on a long journey and they'd been out on the streets, they would wash feet. And this might seem weird and it might seem a bit out of place for us, but we actually read about it in the same account, but in a different gospel in John chapter 13, where Jesus, when they came into the upper room, they all sat around waiting to have their feet washed. Because you see, what was interesting, not just anyone washed your feet. It was quite a humbling, quite a, as we would probably say today, gross and not so cool act to wash the stinky, smelly, dirty feet of some random disciples, okay, who were men with stinky feet. And so every one of the disciples were sitting in there, and they were kind of just looking around, wondering what was going to happen. When suddenly Jesus grabbed a towel and he put it around himself, and in preparation for the meal, he grabbed a bowl with water as well. And he knelt down and started washing his disciples' feet. The reaction of the disciples is amazing. But as Kira shared with us the last time we had communion, the significance and the meaning of this act of washing feet, we want to invite all of you and encourage all of you who'd like to take part in this preparation process, which is all about finding someone and saying to them, you know what, I want to follow the same example that Jesus did. And with humility, with service, do this symbolic act, because for us today, it's not that bad. Most of us had a shower or a bath before you came this morning. At least I'd hope so. And most of our feet are clean. And so really, it's just about symbolically saying, you know what, I want to let you know, the other person that you're doing it for, I want to let you know that I want to serve you, just like Jesus served in preparation for this meal that he had. And I want to serve you this morning. And so we're going to separate now. And so I want you to pair up with someone. What we normally do is the men, they go over to, on my left here, out to the lower west wing. The men will be in the lower west wing. Ladies, and if you want to do it as families, they're going to be gathering in the hall. And once you get into the hall, just find out which side are ladies, which side are families. Important distinction. And so we're going to separate now and take some time just to, in preparation for the meal that we're going to share together, wash each other's feet. Thank you.